All right, we are finishing up the section from chapter 6, verse 9, through chapter 8 and verse 6. We made our way through a decent bit of that, but there are still a few things that we really need to hammer in and get through that tonight. And it's okay if we get a little bit behind for next week, as we'll be looking at did I grab the right one here? So 8:7 through 9:5. So 8:7 through 9:5, and some of that we may even get into tonight, perhaps. There's just not a ton to deal with through that. So hopefully we'll be able to get. I mean, that's what we're supposed to be doing tonight, is 8:7 through 9:5. And the next handout is in the back, so it's already there. And every time before, when I have had it out, I haven't had to say anything about it. So just letting you know, it is there. So does anybody remember what all this chicken scratch was about up here? All right, I want someone to take us point by point through all of this, please. Anybody? No takers? All right, yeah, just remember, we're making a comparison, New Covenant to Old Covenant, and that the New Covenant is greater than the Old Covenant, in that Jesus is the representative for everything coming down in the New Covenant, compared to angels, who were the ones who provided. You know, the Old Covenant came, the words came through them, the law came through them. Moses being the steward of that covenant, and he was the one who led the people to a promised land, to a rest. But even then, they didn't fully enjoy it. So there's a greater rest with Jesus, just as there's a greater covenant with Jesus. And then we're in the middle of the discussion about how Jesus is a better high priest than Aaron. And that's going to really extend through the rest, because he's going to really extrapolate here. Not only is he a greater high priest in status, but what the high priest does under the Aaronic priesthood is less than what Jesus does under the Melchizedekian priesthood. Remember, every one of these comparisons, we start with status and then to what they do, right? It's the same thing here. But he's taken a long time because he's talking about this guy, Melchizedek. Now, over the next few weeks, I'm going to kind of warn you, we're going to start to dive into some of the deeper end of the theological swimming pool. So just be prepared for that. It is not my intent to leave anybody floundering and drowning, trying to understand. So if you have questions, if I'm saying stuff that you're like, what are you talking about? Raise your hand, ask the questions. Probably, if you are willing to do that, there are 3 or 4 other people who have the exact same question that you have. They just aren't comfortable raising their hand. So if you will be the one to do that for everybody else, they would appreciate that. So if you ever feel kind of lost, need me to slow down, something's not making sense, raise your hand, and we can take another stab at it. Make sense? Everybody good there? Because we are going to start getting a little bit heady. I don't think above what anybody here is able to understand. I think everybody here it's well within what you are able to comprehend and grasp. It just might be different to some degree. All right, so we talk about this Melchizedek guy. This guy, remember, his name is a compound word, King of Righteousness. Melchizedek, back in Genesis 14, is the king of Salem, or peace. So he's the king of righteousness, king of peace. All of this wrapped up in this just really enigmatic guy. And he's being compared to Abraham in Genesis chapter 14, and by extension, Aaron. Because the picture that the Hebrews author is painting is that at this point in time, Aaron is in Abraham's loins. So whatever Abraham is doing, Aaron is doing. So if Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek, that means what? Aaron pays tithes to Melchizedek. And if the paying of tithes demonstrates that the one who pays the tithe is the lesser to the greater, then what does that mean for Aaron to Melchizedek in Genesis 14? The lesser to the greater, right? So he's established that Aaron is the lesser, paying tithes to Melchizedek. And then we kind of talked a little bit at the end of class about this just really weird phraseology, in chapter 7. And let's see here. Where do I want to start? I'll just start there in verse 2. Chapter 7, verse 2. To him, that is to Melchizedek, Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. Then he's also the King of Salem, that is King of Peace. And he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. He continues a priest forever. Now, I blew through that at the end last week. How many of y'all felt like that was covered adequately? Okay. All right, so let's cover it at least a little bit more adequately. This guy, it almost sounds like he's supernatural, doesn't it? There's no beginning. There's no end. He's still alive somewhere, walking around. He has no end of days, right? And people that I respect, people I've been in discussions with, and I'm like, man, this guy, he knows his Bible. They say, well, I think he's an angelic being. Because he doesn't have a beginning or an end. He's like an angel who comes out and he, does this thing. He doesn't have parents. He doesn't have a genealogy. I really don't think that's the point at all concerning the Hebrew author's argument. He's not trying to state that Melchizedek as a person, that as a person he is a greater figure than Aaron. What is the Hebrews author trying to demonstrate here? This isn't Melchizedek versus Aaron. This is what? Who wants to take a stab at it? What's that? Well, we'll talk about earthly lineage, but that's not even what's under discussion. Remember, Jesus is greater than what's here, right? So, is this discussion about Melchizedek being greater than Aaron? Is that the point? No, that helps. I mean, that is feeding it, but it's not Melchizedek. It's Melchizedek's what? Priesthood. It's Melchizedek's priesthood, Lorraine said, that is under discussion. And so what we're talking about is the priesthood compared to Aaron's priesthood, right? That's a P. There we go. Okay. So that's what's under discussion. We're comparing the priesthoods. So the point is not to demonstrate that Melchizedek is greater. It's to demonstrate his priesthood is on another level. So now we're going to say, okay, well, what is it that's we can say about their priesthood that makes sense with this language and this terminology? Without father or mother, without genealogy, without a beginning of days or an end of life, he is a priest forever. So those terms, first of all, how do those terms compare to Aaron? And by extension, further down the line. Bruce? Well, yeah, Bruce just said Aaron is a human figure. I think Melchizedek is 100% human. I don't think that Melchizedek in any way, shape, or form is supernatural or different or other than as far as the physical is concerned. Remember, we're not focusing on their personage. We're focusing on their priesthood. So how do these terms affect Aaron's priesthood? Jan? All right. Jan said that Aaron's priesthood under the Old Covenant is very much based on his lineage. And Aaron's priesthood, what happens after Aaron dies? His son is going to take over, right? And what happens after he dies? His son is going to take over. In other words, Aaron's priesthood is going to start here with Aaron, but it's going to extend how far? Until his lineage dies out, right? Or until the necessity of the priesthood goes away. You know, one of those two things, but, you know, it has a definite beginning point, and it's going to have an ending point. I mean, it's only going to serve from here to here, and it's going to go beyond Aaron. Why? Why does it go beyond Aaron? Okay, because he died, but why do they need another one? Why do they need to replace Aaron when he dies? I don't know what you said, Mike. I'm sorry.
For the law to be fulfilled and continued, the service of the priest.
Okay, because the service of this priesthood under the law of Moses is going to extend beyond Aaron's life, isn't it? He's going to fulfill the roles of his priesthood, and when he dies, are those roles still going to need to be fulfilled? Absolutely. Somebody else has to pick up the mantle and keep on going. And when he dies, the next person has to pick up the mantle and keep on going, because the necessity of this priesthood is going to span person to person to person. Therefore, genealogy matters. Mother and father matter. Who you are, who your daddy is, all of those types of things, they matter. You do not get to see the forever of your priesthood. Every one of those high priests is only going to see a tiny little sliver of what the entirety of Aaron's priesthood is. Does everybody see that picture? You know, Aaron's going to live so long, and then he's going to pass it off. And he is done, but the priesthood continues. Let's compare that to Melchizedek and what we know from Genesis 14. Keep in mind that the author of Hebrews here is not giving us information that is secret, that only the Holy Spirit could possibly reveal. That's not the MO that he's giving throughout this entire letter, right? Everything is based off of what the law says. And so he's making a logical argument based off of Genesis chapter 14. Now, from Genesis chapter 14, where did Melchizedek's priesthood come from? Well, in Genesus 14, but we're going to hold that thought for just a second, because that's going to tie in here in just a second. She said the supplication to the Lord, which remember was part of our discussion with Jesus, and the beginning of his priesthood. So, from Genesis 14, did we see a genealogy back there? Did we learn who the high priest was before Melchizedek that passed it on to him? Do we see who receives the high priesthood when he dies? Does his high priesthood, according to Genesis 14, which is all that God revealed to us about Melchizedek, right? I mean, that's what the Hebrews author is saying. This is all we've got. Does it in any way, shape, or form tell us that Melchizedek received his priesthood from his daddy and passed it on to his son? No. His priesthood has nothing to do with genealogy, has nothing to do with mother or father. Therefore, if you're following the logic of the argument that the Hebrews author's making, is there any indication that his priesthood goes beyond him? None, right? There's no indication that his priesthood is going to continue on, which means that his priesthood doesn't need to continue on past him. It's not like Aaron's priesthood, which goes from one to the next, to the next, to the next. In other words, the entirety, or you could say the forever of Melchizedek's priesthood is bound up in whom? It's bound up in Melchizedek. The forever of his priesthood. He's never going to hand the reins to anybody else. He never takes the reins from anybody else. The entirety of Melchizedek's priesthood is 100% Melchizedek. Does that make sense? Now, how does Jesus fit Melchizedek's priesthood? Bruce? 110%. Okay, 110%. All right. In what way, Lorraine?
He's from a tribe that doesn't have priests. A physical tribe.
Okay, you're a little bit ahead, but that's going to be a different argument. I mean, but yes, that is the case. But just stick with what we just said, right? How is Jesus' priesthood like Melchizedek's priesthood, based only on what we've discussed tonight? All right, Julia said his function begins and ends with whom? With him. Does he receive his, well, okay, I'm going to say this, and you're going to say yes, but then I'm going to say, okay, that's correct, but different. Does he receive his priesthood from his father? Yes, he does. But does he receive his priesthood because his father held that priesthood and died and gave it to him? No. His Jesus' priesthood is not based on genealogy. It's not based on passing it on and on. And does Jesus then pass his priesthood on to anybody else? No. The 100% fullness, completion, absolute, everything forever of Jesus' priesthood is wrapped up in whom? It's wrapped up in Jesus. There's nobody else that gives it to him. There's nobody else that's going to take it away. Melchizedek, and going to what Josie was saying just a second ago, Melchizedek, remember how he said all priests are chosen by God? Melchizedek, apparently, again, we're following the Hebrews author's logic, right? We're following his logical argument. If all priests are chosen by God, Melchizedek was a priest of God, then what? He must have been chosen by God. So he's directly chosen by God, he fulfills the entirety of his priesthood, and he doesn't hand it on to anyone else. That is Jesus' priesthood. That's what it means in Psalm 110 when it says, you will be a priest forever. That forever, right, doesn't mean that it doesn't have a starting point, or it just means that the forever, the completion, the 100% of Jesus' priesthood is going to be wrapped up in Jesus. He's not going to take it from anyone. He's not going to hand it to anyone. You will be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. All right. Does that make sense? I know I really blew through that last week and threw a lot of stuff out very, very quickly. Unpacking it a little bit better. Does this help to kind of see the Melchizedek connection here? Now, we go into stuff like what Lorraine was talking about just a second ago, where you see the continuation of the comparison between Levitical priesthood You know what I mean? Like Aaronic priesthood, Levitical priesthood, those are synonymous here. I'm using those interchangeably. The Aaronic priesthood is the Levitical priesthood. So as you keep on going, looking through this, let's see here. Make sure I'm not forgetting anything. All right. What tribe does Aaron come from? Tribe of Aaron, right? Tribe of Levi, right? Aaron's from the tribe of Levi, and that's where all the priests come from. They have to be of the tribe of Levi. Which tribe did Melchizedek come from? None, right, Josie? No, they would have had tribes. They would have been broken down since the time of Israel at the end of Genesis. And so by the time that Aaron takes the mantle in Leviticus, he's chosen from the tribe of Levi. So they would have had that by that time. So if, right here, if perfection, justification, making things right in a moral sense, if that was possible to come through Aaron, then we would have expected that Aaron would be the one in Psalm 110, that you will be a priest forever according to the order of whom? Well, you would expect if Aaron was able to provide perfection, it would be through the order of Aaron. You would expect him to say that, right? And all the Jews would have said, yeah, duh, that makes sense. Of course it's the order of Aaron. What other order out there would possibly do this? But that's not what he says. As Dick said just a second ago, he says, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek, and this kind of goes to what Lorraine was saying earlier, first of all, doesn't come from any of the tribes. Going to what Josie was saying just a second ago, Melchizedek predates Israel. Israel's not around just yet. Israel being Jacob, right? Not the nation, but even just the person in Genesis chapter 14. So we're still in the time of Abraham when Aaron comes out. So, yeah, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. This is an order of priesthood that actually existed before Aaron's order, and it comes onto the page, and then it goes, and it's gone. And I guarantee you, if it weren't for this section of Hebrews, a lot of us would probably have no idea who Melchizedek is. Is that fair to say? I mean, if I started the class and said, anyone know who Melchizedek is, hands would go up. But that's because we've studied Hebrews before. Without this letter, even with his name in Psalm 110, I guarantee you people would be like, Melchi who? What are you talking about? It's like Jehonadab. How many people are just all up and familiar with Jehonadab and him getting in a chariot and all of that story, right? These are the type of things that they're easy to miss, overlook, and that's why the Hebrews author pulls this out. Now, here's where we get into, and I'm really flying through some of this to catch ourselves up. I wanted to make sure that we covered this well enough, but let's talk about the reason that the Hebrews author brought up in chapter 6 and verse 13. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by what? He swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. So there in Genesis chapter 22, there has now been a point where God says, I swear. He swears an oath by himself, and we talked about this last week. When God swears an oath by himself, so we have two witnesses working here, right? That God cannot lie, and God swore by himself. These two witnesses together mean what? It's gonna happen. Take it to the bank, right? I mean, there's no way it can't happen. And did Genesis chapter 22 get fulfilled? Did God greatly multiply them? Absolutely, because he swore he would do it, and he did. And I happen to think this is a very, 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 very common passage that every Israelite's like, well, yeah, duh, it's the binding of Isaac, of course. Melchizedek, he's kind of a obscure story, maybe. This is one of the most important stories in all of the Hebrew Bible, especially for the Israelites. The binding of Isaac is it's one of those that they just would have had at instant recall. It's like a John 3:16 type of thing. They know the binding. They know all about that. So he's using this example in this most familiar story where they probably had countless discussions about, well, God swore here. He swore by an oath. What does that mean? Well, of course, Rabbi Jedediah, that means that it's impossible for God to lie. And he made an oath. There are two witnesses. When God swears something, it absolutely is going to come about. And it's one of the most important things within the scriptures. Way to go, disciple, whoever you are sitting there in the pew, right? That's the way it would have been. He brings that up for what reason? Why did he take us down that little trail? What did Psalm 110 actually say? Let me get over there. Psalm 110, verse 4. What does it say? It says, the Lord has what? The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So he spends so much time talking about God saying, I swear, over here in this common passage that everybody has. There's no discussion. There's nobody's going to debate it. Nobody's going to argue. Everyone's like, yeah, blah, blah, blah. We've known this since we were 2 years old. Of course, when God swears, it's really important. It's going to happen. And then he says, oh yeah, by the way, Psalm 110, what did God do when he said that the Messiah would be in the order, a priest in the order of Melchizedek? Oh, look at that. It says that God swore this. So everything in this discussion over here in Genesis chapter 22, carry it over to Psalm 110, and suddenly this really seemingly easy to go over passage in Psalm 110 takes on so much more importance. You cannot just kind of blow this off and say, who knows what that means? No. God says, I swear. I have sworn. This is on the same level as Genesis 22. It is that important, and it's gonna happen. And at this point, if you're an Israelite, you got to do something with that information. That's got to mean something. That the priest forever that is promised to the Jewish community is not going to come through whom? It's not going to come through Aaron. It's going to come in some way, shape, or form through Melchizedek. Because God swore it. Therefore, there are two witnesses. God swearing that he cannot lie, and God swearing his oath. Can you see why he laid a foundation over here with Genesis 22 and then smacked him in the head with it when he went to Psalm 110 and says, you can't argue against this. You just agreed with me over here in Genesis 22. This is that important. And going to what Lorraine said, if Jesus is the great high priest, that's talked about, could he have been a high priest under this system? No. Remember Lorraine said just a few minutes ago, he's not from the tribe of Levi. He's from what tribe? Judah. Is there anything within the law that allows someone from Judah to become the high priest? No, not at all. But if he's from the order of Melchizedek, does it matter what tribe he's from? No, because this means he has a fully contained priesthood in and of himself without reference to what tribe he comes from. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter who his daddy is. Doesn't matter who his son's going to be. Doesn't matter what tribe he comes from. None of that matters. He is the entirety of his priesthood. He is a high priest forever. Verse 20, chapter 7, verse 20. It was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath, but this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said, the Lord has sworn, will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. By the way, that's just the point we were getting across earlier, right? That he's making them understand this is important. This is more important than this. Because when they established the Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, he didn't make any oaths. He didn't tell them, I swear that you are going to be a priest, anything. He just made them priests. But Jesus, being made a priest under the order of Melchizedek, means a great deal. Verse 22, this makes Jesus the guarantor of what? A better covenant. And that's what it keeps going back to. He is a priest, his priesthood, which is under the order, and you know what it means by order, right? It doesn't mean that he comes from Melchizedek's priesthood. It means that it's in the likeness of. It's the way that it is set up. It's the way it's designed. And so his priesthood is designed the same way Melchizedek's priesthood was designed. Everybody get that? Doesn't mean that he's a continuation of Melchizedek's priesthood. So the way this priesthood is designed, Jesus fulfills, not this one. And God swore this one and said, I will not change my mind. This is the priesthood of that new covenant. Not so here. And this one is going to be better because of that and because of what it's going to continue to do. Let's see here. Verse 23, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing their office. Right, that's our discussion earlier about the forever compared to a tiny slice of. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. That is the continuation, the absoluteness of his priesthood. And the author of Hebrews is going to make the point that Jesus doesn't stop necessarily his priesthood. He is going to stop something, and we'll talk about that though when we get into chapters 9 and 10. Pretty much in 10. So, verse 25, consequently, he's able to save the uttermost, those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. So, his is better because it is a continuing, as long as Jesus remains alive. As long as his priesthood continues, it's not going, the priesthood will not end. Everybody gets that, right? As long as he remains effectively doing his job, his priesthood will not come to an end. And so he is able to continually help those who draw near to God. It's a passage or a phrase I think I brought out before a couple times, saying this idea of drawing near to God, that's a big one. And you're going to see it interspersed throughout Hebrews. This is not going to be the last time that you see him talking about drawing near to God. But we're going to have that conversation hopefully next week as we get into chapter 9 and talk about the idea of drawing near to God. All right, verse 26, it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins, then those for the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. He's dropping pieces on the table right now, and he's going to pick them back up in chapters 9 and 10. All right, we don't need to delve into all of these statements because these are foreshadows of where he's going as he's transitioning from one section to the next section. So we're going to hold off discussions right now about why he doesn't continue to make sacrifices, how he doesn't need to offer things for himself first. And one thing that I didn't bring out, although I pointed out that Melchizedek lived before Aaron, who wrote when does Psalm 110 come into effect? Who wrote it? David, right? Jesus said that David said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet, right? Where does David fall as far as Aaron's concerned? Not a trick question. Chronologically, David before or after Aaron? After, thank you. Yes, way after, right? Well after Aaron. We're looking, 400 or 500 years or so, right? So it's not like when David wrote this, he could have been thinking of this, because this priesthood was already there when David writes Psalm 110, and God swears, while the Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical priesthood is already there, God says there's going to be another one. He can't be referring to the one that's already established if he says there's going to be another one in the future, right? Everybody see that? Yeah, that's also an argument that the Hebrews author is going to pick up and use about something else in just a little bit. All right, quickly running out of time here. All right, again, kind of dropping all of these things. Let's, here in chapter 8, starting in verse 8, he extensively is going to quote an Old Testament passage. What is this passage? All right, Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. And in this passage, first of all, Jeremiah, does he come before or after Aaron? After, thank you, yes. Jeremiah comes way after Aaron. Jeremiah is during the time of the Babylonian captivity, right? So, during this time, as they are realizing that the covenant that they have made with God, they have failed it. They haven't done what they were supposed to do. They haven't been a beacon to the rest of the world. They have been taken out of the land because they failed to uphold the covenant that they made, and that's exactly what God said that he would do to them, right? They're able to see this. That's why this has happened. And in the midst of this, God says, yeah, well, you know what? This whole covenant, there's going to be a new covenant that's going to come anyway. And it's going to be different. Because in this new covenant, there are two major differences that are outlined in Jeremiah 31. And we don't even need to turn there because he quotes it so extensively right here. What are those two main differences? One of them is more pertinent to our discussion than the other. Verse 11, what does he say? All right, in verse 11, in this new covenant, you will not have to teach your neighbor, you will not have to teach your brother to know the Lord, for they will already know him. That's the first difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Those under the Old Covenant, you would have to teach to know the Lord. Under the New Covenant, those who are in the covenant will not have to be taught to know the Lord. All right? Everybody understand that it's a difference? So, again, this one is not pertinent to the discussion, really, so much of this section. So I don't want to get bogged down talking about it. It's the other difference, though, that is going to get repeated at the end of this section, presenting a nice inclusio, where he uses Jeremiah 31 as bookends at the beginning and the end of this section. What's the other difference in verse 12? The forgiveness of sins, which is not anywhere included in the Old Covenant. Now, I say this, I had an article placed into the bulletin this past Sunday. How many of y'all had a chance to read that article? Did anybody? All right. Please, before next week, read that article. I had it put in early enough so that you would be able to have it. The title is something like "When a Sin is Not Sinful," or something like that, I think is what I titled it. That is very specifically, I put it in the bulletin for this class so that you would have it and read it and take a look at it, because it is going to play a huge, important role as we move forward into chapters 9 and 10. And if you can kind of get at least a little bit of what I'm saying from the article, that'll save some of our time in class as far as what we will be discussing. Does that make sense? All right. So, the forgiveness of sins, he says, is different. In the new covenant to come, there will be forgiveness of sins. So what does that say about the old covenant? There is no forgiveness of sins available by means of the old covenant. Does everybody get that's the contrast? You can have your sins forgiven in the new covenant. The old covenant does not provide in any way, shape, or form the forgiveness of sins on a moral level before God. And then he quotes this, and in verse 13, chapter 8, verse 13, he says, in speaking of a new covenant, what does he do to the first one? Bruce?
He makes it obsolete or not enforceable.
Yeah, when a new covenant comes in, and again, he's dropping this here, and he's going to pick it back up later on in chapter 9. But when you have a new covenant that is provided, what it does is it makes the old one obsolete and then makes it ready to do what? Vanish away, disappear. Which is why I happen to think that Hebrews was written before the destruction of Jerusalem. Because when does the old covenant come to its de facto end? Yeah, it still is in focus, it's still going, it's still doing what it does. It doesn't end at the cross. The old covenant continues all the way until it no longer is being fulfilled or is being done at all, and that is the destruction of the temple in AD 70. I don't think it's a coincidence that if Jesus was put on the cross in AD 30, how long do we have between the cross and the destruction of the temple? 40 years. Thank you. Josie was quick with the math. Good job. Yeah, 40 years. Is that a significant number? It is, right? Don't you see that 40-year time period, 40 all the way throughout? I don't think it's coincidence that God allowed this covenant to continue doing its thing and then was like, all right, it's done. We've got 40 years. Now we're going to bring it to its absolute completion, because it has been fulfilled in Jesus in AD 30 and all of that. But he allowed it to run in kind of an inter type of period for about 40 years. But then he brings it to an end. Without a temple and no hope of a rebuilt temple again, it cannot continue as a covenant. So, if, as I think, this was written before AD 70, or at least that's why I think this was written before AD 70, because it gives that picture of a covenant that is about to disappear. All right, we're going to start next week. How much time do we have? You done? Were you waiting for me? Oh, I was waiting for you. I got 40 more years, guys. Let's go. So yeah, we're going to start in chapter 9, and I don't know, maybe if I can do it again, maybe I'll throw another bulletin article in that covers the tabernacle, because that's what we'll be talking about to begin with, are the pieces of the tabernacle and the significance of that type of stuff. So, all right, good class, guys. Thank you.